All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Alex Restrepo. Welcome to our session today regarding continuous data protection. I'm with Solutions Marketing, and I'm here to talk to my friend here, Paul Mayer. Paul, why don't you introduce yourself for a second there? Oh, you're on mute, by the way. I don't know if you can unmute yourself. There you go.
Okay, is that better? How did that happen?
It's okay, go for it. So introduce yourself, Paul.
Yeah, we're off to a great start. Thanks, Alex. So, hey everyone, my name is Paul Mayer. I'm a product manager for Veritas. I've been with the organization for about 15 years now, and I'm based in balmy Roseville, Minnesota.
Well, that explains the frost on your virtual window there. I'm in actually balmy Florida. Gotta love COVID, bringing us all together virtually from disparate parts of the world. So today's session, we're going to talk a little bit about various SLAs and how it's really getting closer and closer to zero as time progresses. The perspective in terms of data protection that we're going to talk about is really our connection with VMware. And we have a really long storied partnership there with VMware in terms of data protection as a whole. Paul, why don't you talk a little bit about, I guess, where the integration has been and is today, and then in a little bit we can get it going into terms of where we're going.
Sure. Yeah, great. So we were
I think some folks that came in were not. All right, Paul, go ahead and unmute yourself again.
Sounds good. Okay.
Yeah,
got it. Thank you. Yeah, so we have been pioneers and partners working closely with VMware really since the very, very beginning. You know, if you look back into the early 2000s, we had, you know, one of the first waves of integration with VMware and had our V-Ray technology that allowed us to sort of take an X-ray type view inside of the virtual machines, break that apart and provide a single pass backup that would give us granular recovery out of that. And we've continued to innovate along those lines. And we continue to offer a stun-based backup using the VMware integration at the hypervisor layer. And we also now, with our resiliency platform, provide the ability to do a continuous protection of VMware for a disaster recovery continuance use case where we take each and every IO, we capture a copy of that write, and we send that off to a DR site, be it another data center, colo, or cloud environment.
So, and by the way, folks, in the chat, we mentioned, go ahead and mute yourself if you can. We'll do our best to mute everybody as they come in, but definitely bring your questions that you have in the chat, and we'll be happy to answer them both from text, but also if there is a question that you want to double click on, feel free to raise your hand and we'll do our best to unmute you so you can participate. So Paul, you talked a lot about the experience in terms of historically what we've done with VMware. The point in time backups that we've done have been pretty good, but obviously the demands of business are getting to where RPO and RTO is really getting narrower and narrower in terms of what the needs are. So what are you seeing in terms of where that spectrum is today, and what are some of the reasons that we're seeing those pressures on organizations of all sizes?
Yeah, those are great observations, Alex. I think you've got the increased pressure around RPO and RTO in general in an organization, the scrutiny and pressure on IT to provide this out as a service is, always, the pressure is always growing there. You also take into account you think about where we started out, in their VMware integration, 15 plus years ago. And at that time, VMware was sort of the new kid on the block in terms of, the services that it was providing. And they were, organizations were placing lower risk workloads into the VM environment, so non-critical. And so what we've seen is, based on the explosive adoption over those years of VMware, we're now to the point where we see a lot of organizations putting most of their workloads by default into a virtualized environment. And so they're really pushing the envelope in terms of the performance that they're able to achieve on that. So you couple that, so the criticality of workloads, with really with the explosion, also data growth, with data continuing to grow, depending on the analysts that you look at, IDC numbers, Gartner, et cetera, we'll see 40 to 50% continued growth year over year. And that puts increasing pressure on the, RPO and RTO capabilities as well. So all those just continue to mount. And so the world has changed a lot since VMware became a first-class citizen.
Yeah, those are great points, and I think not only is it that we have mission critical applications running on VMware. Obviously, that's the case, and like you said, obviously they need protected. They need to be protected with as close to zero RPO and RTO. But not only are there more of them, but the pressure on them has increased, right? The landscape has shifted
Right.
in terms of what the challenges are.
Got it.
Maybe 20 years ago, you'd have a random virus created by some hacker because they thought it was fun. Today, there's a profit motive, right? And that's kind of
Yeah,
impacting
absolutely.
the risks there. So what are some of the costs that we're seeing of downtime, from things like ransomware, but also reputation, time loss,
Yeah.
all those kinds of things? Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and you mentioned ransomware, and that's just a great way that organizations are learning very rapidly, in some cases the hard way, what the cost is of that data. And there's a lot of studies that would show that without data for any period of time, your organization is, risks going out of business. The curve is exponential. So, if you're talking about an hour or two, there can be reputation damage and so forth, and transaction costs missed. But if that goes on for days, which in the case of ransomware, we see, that being more the norm. If that goes on for that kind of period, now you're getting into that zone where you're risking actually going out of business, because you just can't recreate that fast enough. You don't have the systems in place to do that. So it becomes a very permanently damaging catastrophic event.
And in terms of speeding up that process, like with the point in time backups, we've seen incrementals that can happen every hour, even down every 15 minutes. That's pretty good, but
Yep.
still not zero. On the other end of the spectrum, we do have high availability. If you're going to set up clustering, we have technologies like InfoScale and what it's able to provide in terms of near zero, millisecond level availability.
Yep.
That's the extreme other end. In between, we've had, up to today, the resiliency platform, right? And the replication it's able to do, it's
Right.
able to tap into technology that VMware is providing to us, right? In terms of the VAIO interaction, where we're grabbing information at the hardware layer beneath the
Yeah.
software. So, going forward, is there any way we can take that technology and apply it to some of the point in time backups that we take with NetBackup?
Yep. Absolutely right. Spot on, Alex. If you look at the spectrum of technologies that you just described, they're each intended to address a different issue. So we have technologies that are targeted across different availability and resiliency requirements, and those are critical to keep the systems up and available in the event that something happens to a hardware layer component or an infrastructure layer component. That resiliency is key. Now, if you're into a situation where you're talking about data loss or corruption, whether it's through a mishap or through a ransomware attack. Now you're in the process of determining how far back do I have to go and how long is it going to take me to get back online. So your classic RPO and RTO, recovery point objective, recovery time objective. So now you talked about the capabilities that we have in the Veritas resiliency platform for continuous data protection. I mentioned that a little bit earlier as well. And that is the starting point. That is the foundation that we're talking about. We utilize the VMware VIO driver in that workload, in that application, to capture a copy of each and every write. And in the case of VRP, we send that write to a DR site, and we use that as a collection of recovery points. We can determine how many of those recovery points we want to keep for what kind of window and what granularity we want to keep. So the most common scenario would be, gee, I want to be able to roll back to many granular recovery points for, let's say a 2-hour sliding window or something like that. And that's going to give you the ability to dial back transaction by transaction, basically minute by minute, to say, okay, gee, I had a ransomware attack, or I've discovered a corrupt database. Now I want to roll back 1 minute and see if it was corrupt. Oh, it was. Roll back 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Oh, there I was clean. So I'm going to restart from that point and continue on. So that's the concept of continuous data protection. So now what we're doing is sort of phase two of that, leveraging that development, that innovation that we've done within the resiliency platform to achieve true continuous data protection to a DR location. Now we have that same requirement back in the data center. And so not everything is a catastrophic disaster that you want to recover somewhere else. The other 99.9% of the recoveries that you want to do are actually going to be in the data center, whether it's rolling back an entire application to a previous, just recent point in time, or if it is, if you want to go in and selectively grab a particular item out of that workload or out of that file system, you want the ability to do that without going through a recovery process to do that. So absolutely spot on. That is the idea, to take that technology back into the data center. Now, one of the key use cases that we'll focus on first and foremost, what really seems to resonate with net backup users, is this ability to, as we do in the VRP side, is to be able to provide a layer of protection in that VMware environment without using the stun feature in VMware. So stun is a great technology in that it gives you a consistent point in time that you can then use as your foundation to capture a nice clean recovery point. That's great for data protection. It's terrible in many cases for production. And so we have, you know, thousands of customers using net backup to protect their VMware environments. And with this increasing pressure that we talked about earlier, with the mission criticality growing, the exponential data growth, and so forth, they can't afford to impact the production on that VMware environment to the extent that a stun event can cause. So that's the next frontier for us, is utilizing this continuous data protection technology back in the data center, using that same VIO driver, so leveraging the investment and innovation that we've made there to now protect a production VMware environment in the same data center, capturing each and every IO, pulling that out of the environment and giving recovery points that are then ingested into net backup and available for recovery through a standard net backup process.
And I think you more or less addressed this question already. In fact, Kenneth was just asking in the chat, right? Will we ever see CDP as part of net backup alone without VRP involved? And the answer, unequivocally is yes. That's something that you're testing right now. That's actively being worked on today. And I think what's important here is to kind of up-level a little bit the value there. What we're talking about is completing the spectrum. I think it was in the title, right? We're completing the RPO and RTO spectrum. And so, sometimes you have certain types of applications that absolutely need millisecond high availability. InfoScale has that covered 100% with mixed environments, no problem. Sometimes you need other applications that have to be scripted in terms of the stack being stood up in a certain amount, certain order, and with a certain limit on the replication variance. And so that's where resiliency platform kind of shines, is in that middle area. And then we have point in time backups, but daily or even hourly backups sometimes aren't enough for certain types of workloads. And so let's crank the dial a little bit and be able to get some of that continuous data protection into our otherwise robust point-in-time backup solution, which is net backup. And that's what we're talking about here. That's what Paul's addressing. And so hopefully that addresses your question directly, Kenneth. I want to double click on it a little bit, Paul, because I have some background with net backup. I'm familiar with it. So how does this work, in terms of tuning, in terms of my policy configuration, my data protection plan? Can I set a certain data set to be protected with continuous data protection for X amount of time, but then I also want to keep the data for an extended period of time without rollback features for compliance, let's say. Like, let's say I have HIPAA records I got to keep for 7 years or something like that. How does that work? Can you talk a little bit about what the tuning looks like?
Yes. So great question. What you've sort of articulated there is the bigger vision of where we're going in terms of providing an ongoing data capture that could be recoverable directly from that native format that we're capturing directly out of VMware. And when I say native format, I mean we leave it in its VMware format without compressing, encrypting, deduplicating, and moving off to a secondary storage target. So that's where we're going with it. And currently what we have in beta right now is the ability to capture this data stream coming out of VMware in a stun-free manner and ingesting it then outside of, without touching the VMware environment at that point, ingesting from this cache or gateway, as we refer to it as, we ingest recovery points into native net backup. And once it's in net backup, you can do anything with that you can do with other forms of backup within net backup. So in other words, you could tier that to cloud if you wanted to. You could do instant access out of an MSDP storage pool, and launch into the workload directly from there. And in certain small to medium scale operations, that is probably going to be just fine. Where we're headed with it then in the future phase will be to add what you're talking about in terms of what I would call true CDP, and that's the ability to recover without going through a recovery operation. So utilizing that cache space as a high performance, native formatted, ready to go VMware point in time that we can rewind to with granularity to the exact point in time that we want and launch into it directly from there.
So, I mean, that's fantastic. I think the idea that we often talk about net backup being the core of the enterprise data services platform, but I think the capabilities you're describing really expand net backup beyond just standard backup and recovery. And it really starts to become a modern platform for modern challenges in terms of SLAs. And this is great for VMware, absolutely. But what about, expanding this beyond virtualization? Is there any chance that we'll be able to get the same type of continuous data protection beyond VMware?
Without a doubt, Alex, it's our clear intention and our direction to start with VMware. That is where a good portion of the data exists that we're protecting. That's also where we're hearing from customers the most that we need this stun-free approach. So we're starting there, but we have a rich portfolio of assets that are focused also on non-virtualized workloads. And we'll take advantage of the capabilities that we have in other areas of the portfolio, including the net backup agents that we have for non-virtualized workloads. So there's a lot of tools that we can bring to bear in this area, and we believe that for mission critical workloads that are outside of the virtualized environment, there's going to be a lot of requirement here as well. And so, absolutely, our intention is to focus there as well.
I think Jacob, just put a question in there that's freaking awesome. I want to ask that question right now. How do you plan to ensure stun-free app database consistency with continuous data protection? I think that's a great question. How do we plan to do that?
It's a yeah, it's a fantastic question, and so the approach is pretty straightforward. So you think about how we do that in a streaming backup environment. We use an agent to put a workload in hot backup mode, and from there we then perform the backup operation until we're complete. Then we release it from hot backup mode, apply logs to the database, and it's back in production. So it's kind of running in a degraded mode for a while. In a CDP environment, what we'll likely do to address that is utilize a similar agent talking to the same API, but instead of putting it into a hot backup mode for any length of time, it will be a very quick entry into that mode, and we'll insert a marker into the data stream that identifies that as a consistent point in time. So we'll use the API, quiesce, flush memory buffers, ingest into the IO stream, capture a clean, consistent point in time, and then release the database as we're capturing the IO writes from there on. And you'd have the ability to do that on whatever frequency make sense. There would be some overhead with that, but you don't have to do that every minute. You can have a consistency checkpoint every hour if you wanted to, and it's not that the other points in time are not recoverable. There would just be some crash recovery processing going on, but it all comes down to how critical that consistency is in the workload. I think it's really critical. I've been kind of surprised in conversations with a number of customers actually who have said that it's not as critical as you might think to us. We can deal with crash consistent recovery. We do it all the time, and we don't experience a lot of data loss around that. But we're definitely planning to go down that path. We think it's a better experience, and that'll be kind of how it'll work.
Awesome. Hopefully that addressed your question, Jacob. I know I learned a lot from that answer, so thanks, Paul. And we have another question from Bobby in there. I think it touches on something we just talked about previously, which was are we expanding CDP beyond just VMware? He specifically asks about Microsoft and Nutanix AHV. So are we looking at those platforms for CDP?
Yeah, I mean, those would all be candidates. There's nothing about this, the way that we're building it, there's nothing about it that would be specific to a VMware environment. Obviously, the VIO driver implementation, that is specific, but we can figure out how to tap into any IO stream. That is not an issue. So we'll look at this in terms of, do we go deep first and really flesh this out on VMware and then flesh it out on a couple of the key non-virtualized workloads, and then where do we go from there? So it'll be, these are all, we want to do this right. My feeling is I'd rather go deep first, then wide, and really nail it down on a couple key areas before we try to proliferate across a lot of virtualization platforms. But we'll see what the market really demands in that area. And we're building this in such a way, though, that just is, just to be really clear, it is not hardwired to VMware. The architecture is very extensible for other platforms.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's worth noting two things you said earlier. One, this isn't new territory for us because we've already engaged VAIO with the resiliency platform. And two, VMware, I get it that it's not everything, right? Not everybody's using VMware or not everybody's using VMware exclusively. But from our perspective, it's certainly the predominance, right? The vast majority of the workloads that we're seeing out there that we're backing up are VMware workloads. And so, from that point of view, I think it's just it makes sense from a numbers game. But I really like the fact that you're mentioning the fact that this is architected in such a way that it's agnostic. And so that it is something that can be iterated on to include these other vendors, these other virtualization platforms as needed in the future. I think it makes a lot of sense. Let's see, there's another question here. If you recover from an earlier point in time, can you later recover from a later point in time? Yeah, so I think, and Paul, I'm gonna toss it to you, obviously, for the official answer, but you mentioned earlier that there's the rollback capability, and what we're talking about there from a CDP point of view is rapidity, right? We're talking about the ability to very quickly recover from non-deduplicated data that's cached on hand, and so it can come in very quickly. But that same data is getting written to the point-in-time backups. Is that accurate, Paul? So we are keeping that data for point-in-time backup purposes, right?
Yes. So yes, that is true. We are capturing points in time out of that CDP repository or cache. But it's even better than that, Alex, because we can not only capture points in time into a net backup repository, but we can maintain multiple points in time in the CDP gateway itself. So what we would be able to do is you will be able to recover, and I think the question was, if I recover to one point in time, can I then recover to a different point in time later? And the answer is yes. You can configure that cache to retain as many recovery points as you want. And there's storage consumed with each of those recovery points and the duration of time that you would allocate to that disk space. But I would envision, it's going to be probably dependent on the tier of workload that we're talking about. But for tier one workloads, I would envision, probably having maybe 1 minute increments of recovery point for, going back, let's say an hour or 2 hours. And then for the next 24 hours every hour, and something like that. And then beyond that, if you have to go back further than 24 hours, then you're probably going to the net backup environment and recovering from a dedupe storage pool. But that's all going to be configurable. The other thing that will be configurable will be the ability to determine on a workload by workload basis which ones you want to have available for cache recovery at all. So you might have a tier 1 workload that you want to have 24 hours of recovery point in the CDP gateway so that you can recover directly from that without going to dedupe data, compress data, data in cloud, data on tape, etc. You'd be able to pull that directly from the cache. There are other workloads where you might say, I don't need that because there's cost associated with that gateway. So within the same gateway, our vision is to tier that to say, if you want to have all of your workloads recoverable from the gateway, great. If you want to have only the top 10% in terms of criticality, carve out the space for that. And then tier 2 workloads, you can not plan on recovery from the gateway and just push those out to net backup and do recovery there. We have even built this in such a way that, if you think of, let's say you're doing one workload and that workload is a terabyte, and you want to carve out, that's not a realistic example, but just a simple example, right? So you've sized your gateway cache for that workload. You would think, well, you're probably going to have enough landing space for, probably 2x the size of the workload. So you've got enough room for recovery points and overhead and so forth. We've actually designed it so that you don't even have to have enough room for the first full backup. We can truly use that gateway as cache. And when it starts to fill to a certain point, we can pause the IO trickle coming out of the VMware environment and push the recovery point out to net backup, clear the cache, and then resume the operation. So we could actually get by without even enough space for one full backup, if you will, on that gateway cache. I don't think that's going to be a best practice, but there's a lot of concern around this feature in terms of the space that it would consume, and we've built it in such a way where we can get by with as little storage as you want to allocate to it.
Awesome. So we have about 3 minutes left. There's a good question that came in. Basically, just the question was, is there a replication gateway that is either software or hardware defined? I think we have a good answer for this one, right? In terms of what the technology is that we're leveraging. So Paul? I'll give you an example. So I think the question is, today with the Veritas resiliency platform, there's a replication gateway that's a software defined appliance. Is there an equivalent that would have to be configured for net backup as it taps into VAIO?
Yeah, so here's the good news on that front is the node that manages the gateway in the net backup CDP is a net backup media server. So it's going to be specially configured for this task, but it's going to be a native media server. So anyone who's comfortable with administering a net backup media server would have that's how it's going to show up in the admin console. Yeah, you're the guy. You're the guy. If you don't know how to do it, call Alex.
So we have just 2 minutes left, and we do have to close on time because we do have Dr. Michio Kaku up. But one last question that I think it's important to bring up here is just somebody asked, can we tier the CDP data to the cloud? And and I think that's an easy one to close out on here with our 2 minutes to go. So Paul, can we tier to the cloud?
Yeah, so the way that it would work is once we've ingested from CDP into net backup, and we can do that currently in the beta that's out there, we can ingest up to 30-minute intervals. Once it's in net backup, it's a native net backup recovery point, and from there you can move that out to cloud. If you want to, you can tier it to object storage in the data center. Whatever you want to do in a native net backup operating mode, you're able to do with that data.
Awesome. Great answer to that. And the joys of live recording here, folks.
Yeah.
Anyway, a minute to go. I want to thank Paul for answering our questions. I want to thank all of you for bringing some really fantastic questions to this conversation. And be sure to tune into Dr. Michio Kaku's session happening on the main stage here in about 30 seconds. Thanks, everybody, and hope you had a great day here with
Thanks, everyone.
Cloud. See ya.
Thank you.